The next section heading, How the Bible is Dealt with. The result of this dismembering of the records and this partition of them throughout the centuries is naturally that the scriptures can no longer be attributed to the authors whose names they bear. The modernists have no hesitation in affirming generally that these books, and especially the Pentateuch and the first three Gospels, have been gradually formed from a primitive, brief narration by additions, by interpolations of theological or allegorical interpretations, or parts introduced only for the purpose of joining different passages together. This means, to put it briefly and clearly, that in the sacred books we must admit a vital evolution, springing from and corresponding with the evolution of faith. The traces of this evolution, they tell us, are so visible in the books that one might almost write a history of it. Indeed, this history they actually do write, and with such an easy assurance that one might believe them to have seen with their own eyes the writers at work through the ages, amplifying the sacred books. To aid them in this, they call to their assistance that branch of criticism which they call textual, and labor to show that such a fact or such a phase is not in its right place, adducing other arguments of the same kind. They seem, in fact, to have constructed for themselves certain types of narration and discourses upon which they base their assured verdict as to whether a thing is or is not out of place. Let him who can judge how far they are qualified in this way to make such distinctions. To hear them descant of their works on the sacred books, in which they have been able to discover so much that is defective, one would imagine that before them nobody had even turned over the pages of Scripture. The truth is that a whole multitude of doctors, far superior to them in genius, in erudition, in sanctity, have sifted the sacred books in every way, and so far from finding in them anything blameworthy, have thanked God more and more heartily, the more deeply they've gone into them, of his divine bounty in having vouchsafed to speak thus to men. Unfortunately, these great doctors did not enjoy the same aids to study that are possessed by the modernists, for they did not have for their rule and guide a philosophy borrowed from the negation of God, and a criterion which consists of themselves. We believe, then, that we have set forth with sufficient clearness the historical method of the modernists. The philosopher leads the way, the historian follows, and then, in due order, come the internal and textual critics. And since it is characteristic of the primary cause to communicate its virtue to causes which are secondary, it is quite clear that the criticism with which we are concerned is not any kind of criticism, but that which is rightly called agnostic, immanentist, and evolutionist criticism. Hence, anyone who adopts it and employs it makes profession thereby of the errors contained in it, and places himself in opposition to Catholic teaching. This being so, it is much a matter for surprise that it should have found acceptance to such an extent amongst certain Catholics. Two causes may be assigned for this. First, the close alliance which the historians and critics of this school have formed among themselves, independent of all differences of nationality or religion. Second, their boundless effrontery, by which, if one then makes any utterance, the others applaud him in chorus, proclaiming that science has made another step forward, while if an outsider should desire to inspect the new discovery for himself, they form a coalition against him. He who denies it is decried as one who is ignorant, while he who embraces and defends it has all their praise. In this way they entrap not a few, who, did they but realize what they are doing, would shrink back with horror. The domineering overbearance of those who teach the errors, and the thoughtless compliance of the more shallow minds who are sent to them, create a corrupted atmosphere which penetrates everywhere and carries infection with it. But let us pass to the apologist. Section heading, The Modernist as Apologist. The modernist apologist depends in two ways on the philosopher. First, indirectly, inasmuch as his subject matter is history dictated, as we have seen, by the philosopher. And secondly, directly, inasmuch as he takes both his doctrines and his conclusions from the philosopher. Hence, that common axiom of the modernist school that in the new apologetics, controversies in religion must be determined by psychological and historical research. The modernist apologists, then, enter the arena proclaiming to the rationalists that though they are defending religion, they have no intention of employing the data of the sacred books or the histories in current use in the church and written upon the old lines, but real history composed on modern principles and according to the modern method. In all this, they assert that they're not using an argumentum ad hominem because they are really of the opinion that the truth is to be found only in this kind of history. They feel that it is not necessary for them to make profession of their own sincerity in their writings. They are already known to and praised by the rationalists as fighting under the same banner, and they not only plume themselves on these encomiums, which would only provoke disgust in a real Catholic, but use them as a counter-compensation to the reprimands of the Church. Let us see how the modernist conducts his apologetics. The aim he sets before himself is to make one who is still without faith attain that experience of the Catholic religion which, according to the system, is the sole basis of faith. There are two ways open to him, the objective and the subjective. The first of them starts from agnosticism. It tends to show that religion, especially the Catholic religion, is endowed with such vitality as to compel every psychologist and historian of good faith to recognize that its history hides some element of the unknown. To this end, it's necessary to prove that the Catholic religion, as it exists today, is that which was founded by Jesus Christ. That is to say, that it is nothing else than the progressive development of the germ which he brought into the world. Hence it is imperative, first of all, to establish what this germ was, and this the modernist claims to be able to do by the following formula. Christ announced the coming of the kingdom of God, which was to be realized within a brief lapse of time, and of which he was to become the Messiah, the divinely given founder and ruler. Then it must be shown how this germ, always immanent and permanent in the Catholic religion, has gone on slowly developing in the course of history, adapting itself successively to the different circumstances through which it has passed, borrowing from them by vital assimilation all the doctrinal, cultural, ecclesiastical forms that served its purpose, whilst on the other hand it surmounted all obstacles, vanquished all enemies, and survived all assaults and all combats. Anyone who well and duly considers this mass of obstacles, adversaries, attacks, combats, and the vitality and fecundity which the Church has shown throughout them all, must admit that if the laws of evolution are visible in her life, they fail to explain the whole of her history. The unknown rises forth from it and presents itself before us. Thus do they argue, not perceiving that the determination of the primitive germ is only an a priori assumption of agnostic and evolutionist philosophy, and that the germ itself has been gratuitously defined so that it may fit in with their contention. But while they endeavor by this line of reasoning to prove and plead for the Catholic religion, these new apologists are more than willing to grant and to recognize that there are in it many things which are repulsive. Nay, they admit openly and with ill-concealed satisfaction that they have found that even its dogma is not exempt from errors and contradictions. They add also that this is not only excusable, but, curiously enough, that it is even right and proper. In the sacred books, there are many passages referring to science or history, where, according to them, manifest errors are to be found. But, they say, the subject of these books is not science or history, but only religion and morals. In them, history and science serve only as a species of covering to enable the religious and moral experiences wrapped up in them to penetrate more readily among the masses. The masses understood science and history as they are expressed in these books, and it's clear that the expression of science and history in a more perfect form would have proved not so much a help as a hindrance. Moreover, they add, the sacred books, being essentially religious, are necessarily quick with life. Now life has its own truth and its own logic, quite different from rational truth and rational logic, belonging as they do to a different order, namely truth of adaptation and of proportion, both with what they call the medium in which it lives and with the end for which it lives. Finally, the modernists, losing all sense of control, go so far as to proclaim as true and legitimate whatever is explained by life. We, venerable brethren, for whom there is but one and only truth, and who hold that the sacred books, written under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, have God for their author, declare that this is equivalent to attributing to God himself the lie of utility or officious lie. And we say with St. Augustine, in an authority so high, admit but one officious lie, and there will not remain a single passage of those apparently difficult to practice or to believe, which on the same most pernicious rule may not be explained as a lie uttered by the author willfully and to serve a purpose. And thus it will come about, the Holy Doctor continues, that everybody will believe and refuse to believe what he likes or dislikes in them, namely the Scriptures. But the modernists pursue their way eagerly. They grant also that certain arguments adduced in the sacred books in proof of a given doctrine, like those, for example, which are based on the prophecies, have no rational foundation to rest on. But they defend even these as artifices of preaching, which are justified by life. More than that, they're ready to admit, nay, to proclaim, that Christ himself manifestly erred in determining the time when the coming of the kingdom of God was to take place. And they tell us that we must not be surprised at this, since even he himself was subject to the laws of life. After this, what is to become of the dogmas of the Church? The dogmas bristle with flagrant contradictions, but what does it matter, since apart from the fact that vital logic accepts them, they are not repugnant to symbolical truth? Are we not dealing with the infinite, and has not the infinite an infinite variety of aspects? In short, to maintain and defend these theories, they do not hesitate to declare that the noblest homage that can be paid to the infinite is to make it the object of contradictory statements. But when they justify even contradictions, what is it that they will refuse to justify? The next section heading is Subjective Arguments. But it is not solely by objective arguments that the non-believer may be disposed to faith. There are also those that are subjective, and for this purpose the modernist apologists return to the doctrine of immanence. They endeavor, in fact, to persuade their non-believer that down in the very depths of his nature and his life lie hidden the need and the desire for some religion, and this not a religion of any kind, but the specific religion known as Catholicism, which, they say, is absolutely postulated by the perfect development of life. And here again we have grave reason to complain that there are Catholics who, while rejecting immanence as a doctrine, employ it as a method of apologetics, and who do this so prudently that they seem to admit not merely a capacity and a suitability for the supernatural, such as has at all times been emphasized within due limits by Catholic apologists, but there is in human nature a true and rigorous need for the supernatural order. Truth to tell, it is only the moderate modernists who make this appeal to an exigency for the Catholic religion. As for the others, who might be called integralists, they would show to the non-believer, as hidden in his being, the very germ which Christ himself had in his consciousness and which he transmitted to mankind. Such, venerable brethren, is a summary description of the apologetic method of the modernists, in perfect harmony with their doctrines, methods and doctrines replete with errors, made not for edification but for destruction, not for the making of Catholics but for the seduction of those who are Catholics into heresy, and tending to the utter subversion of all religion. The next section heading is The Modernist as a Reformer. It remains for us now to say a few words about the modernist as a reformer. From all that has preceded, it is abundantly clear how great and how eager is the passion of such men for innovation. In all Catholicism, there is absolutely nothing on which it does not fasten. They wish philosophy to be reformed, especially in the ecclesiastical seminaries. They wish the scholastic philosophy to be relegated to the history of philosophy and to be classed among obsolete systems, and the young men to be taught modern philosophy, which alone is true and suited to the times in which we live. They desire the reform of theology. Rational theology is to have modern philosophy for its foundation, and positive theology is to be founded on the history of dogma. As for history, it must be written and taught only according to their methods and modern principles. Dogmas and their evolution, they affirm, are to be harmonized with science and history. In the Catechism, no dogmas are to be asserted except those that have been reformed and are within the capacity of the people. Regarding worship, they say, the number of external devotions is to be reduced, and steps must be taken to prevent their further increase, though indeed some of the admirers of symbolism are disposed to be more indulgent on this head. They cry out that ecclesiastical government requires to be reformed in all its branches, but especially in its disciplinary and dogmatic departments. They insist that both outwardly and inwardly it must be brought into harmony with the modern conscience, which now wholly tends towards democracy. A share in ecclesiastical government should therefore be given to the lower ranks of the clergy and even to the laity. An authority which is too much concentrated should be decentralized. The Roman congregations, and especially the Index and the Holy Office, must be likewise modified. The ecclesiastical authority must alter its line of conduct in the social and political world. While keeping outside political organizations, it must adapt itself to them in order to penetrate them with its spirit. With regard to morals, they adopt the principle of the Americanists that the active virtues are more important than the passive and are to be more encouraged in practice. They ask that the clergy should return to their primitive humility and poverty, and that in their ideas and action they should admit the principles of modernism. And there are some who, gladly listening to the teaching of their Protestant masters, would desire the suppression of the celibacy of the clergy. What is there left in the Church which is not to be reformed by them and according to their principles? Section heading, Modernism, the synthesis of all heresies. It may perhaps seem to some, venerable brethren, that we have dwelt at too great length on this exposition of the doctrines of the modernists. But it was necessary that we should do so, both in order to meet their customary charge that we do not understand their ideas, and to show that their system does not consist in scattered and uncollected theories, but, as it were, in a closely connected whole, so that it is not possible to admit one without admitting all. For this reason, too, we have had to give to this exposition a somewhat didactic form, and not to shrink from employing certain unwonted terms which the modernists have brought into use. And now, with our eyes fixed upon the whole system, no one will be surprised that we should define it to be the synthesis of all heresies. Undoubtedly, were anyone to attempt the task of collecting together all the errors that have been broached against the faith, and to concentrate into one the sap and substance of them all, he could not succeed in doing so better than the modernists have done. Nay, they have gone farther than this, for as we have already intimated, their system means the destruction not of the Catholic religion alone, but of all religion. Hence the rationalists are not wanting in their applause, and the most frank and sincere among them congratulate themselves in having found in the modernists the most valuable of all allies. Let us turn for a moment, venerable brethren, to that most disastrous doctrine of agnosticism. By it, every avenue to God on the side of the intellect is barred to man, while a better way is supposed to be opened from the side of a certain sense of the soul and action. But who does not see how mistaken is such a contention? For the sense of the soul is the response to the action of the thing which the intellect or the outward senses set before it. Take away the intelligence, and man, already inclined to follow the senses, becomes their slave. Doubly mistaken from another point of view, for all these fantasies of the religious sense will never be able to destroy common sense, and common sense tells us that emotion and everything that leads the heart captive proves a hindrance instead of a help to the discovery of truth. We speak of truth in itself, for that other purely subjective truth, the fruit of the internal sense and action, if it serves its purpose for the play of words, is of no benefit to the man who wants above all things to know whether outside himself there is a God into whose hands he is one day to fall. True, the modernists call in experience to eke out their system. But what does this experience add to that sense of the soul? Absolutely nothing, beyond a certain intensity and a proportionate deepening of the conviction of the reality of the object. But these two will never make the sense of the soul into anything but sense, nor will they alter its nature, which is liable to deception when the intelligence is not there to guide it. On the contrary, they but confirm and strengthen this nature, for the more intense the sense is, the more it is really sense. And as we are here dealing with the religious sense and the experience involved in it, it is known to you, venerable brethren, how necessary in such a matter is prudence, and the learning by which prudence is guided. You know it from your own dealings with souls, and especially with souls in whom sentiment predominates. You know it also from your reading of works of ascetical theology, works for which the modernists have but little esteem, but which testify to a science and a solidity far greater than theirs, and to a refinement and subtlety of observation far beyond any which the modernists take credit to themselves for possessing. It seems to us nothing short of madness, or the least consummate temerity, to accept for true, and without investigation, these incomplete experiences which are the vaunt of the modernist. Let us for a moment put the question: if experiences have so much force and value in their estimation, why do they not attach equal weight to the experience that so many thousands of Catholics have that the modernists are on the wrong path? Is it that the Catholic experiences are the only ones which are false and deceptive? The vast majority of mankind holds, and always will hold firmly, that sense and experience alone, when not enlightened and guided by reason, cannot reach to the knowledge of God. What then remains but atheism and the absence of all religion? Certainly it's not the doctrine of symbolism that will save us from this. For if all the intellectual elements, as they call them, of religion are nothing more than mere symbols of God, will not the very name of God or of divine personality be also a symbol? And if this be admitted, the personality of God will become a matter of doubt, and the gate will be open to pantheism. And to pantheism pure and simple, that other doctrine of the divine immanence leads directly. For this is the question which we ask: does or does not this immanence leave God distinct from man? If it does, in what does it differ from the Catholic doctrine, and why does it reject the doctrine of external revelation? If it does not, it is pantheism. Now the doctrine of immanence, in the modernist acceptation, holds and professes that every phenomenon of the conscience proceeds from man as man. The rigorous conclusion from this is the identity of man with God, which means pantheism. The distinction which modernists make between science and faith leads to the same conclusion. The object of science, they say, is the reality of the knowable. The object of faith, on the contrary, is the reality of the unknowable. Now, what makes the unknowable unknowable is the fact that there is no proportion between its object and the intellect, a defective proportion which nothing whatever, even in the doctrine of the modernist, can suppress. Hence the unknowable remains and will eternally remain unknowable to the believer as well as to the philosopher. Therefore, if any religion at all is possible, it can only be the religion of an unknowable reality. And why this religion might not be that soul of the universe, of which certain rationalists speak, is something which certainly does not seem to us apparent. These reasons suffice to show superabundantly by how many roads modernism leads to atheism and to the annihilation of all religion. The error of Protestantism made the first step on this path, that of modernism makes the second, atheism makes the next. So far in this encyclical, St. Pius X has been dealing with an analysis of modernist teaching. That's part one. Now we come to part two, the cause of modernism. To penetrate still deeper into the meaning of modernism and to find a suitable remedy for so deep a sore, it behoves us, venerable brethren, to investigate the causes which have engendered it and which foster its growth. That the proximate and immediate cause consists in an error of the mind cannot be open to doubt. We recognize that the remote causes may be reduced to two: curiosity and pride. Curiosity by itself, if not prudently regulated, suffices to account for all errors. Such is the opinion of our predecessor, Gregory XVI, who wrote, "A lamentable spectacle is that presented by the aberrations of human reason when it yields to the spirit of novelty, when, against the warnings of the apostle, it seeks to know beyond what it is meant to know, and when, relying too much on itself, it thinks it can find the truth outside the Catholic Church, wherein truth is to be found without the slightest shadow of error." But it is pride which exercises an incomparably greater sway over the soul to blind it and lead it into error, and pride sits in modernism as in its own house, finding sustenance everywhere in its doctrines and lurking in its every aspect. It is pride which fills modernists with that self-assurance by which they consider themselves and pose as the rule for all. It is pride which puffs them up with that vainglory which allows them to regard themselves as the sole possessors of knowledge, and makes them say, elated and inflated with presumption, "We are not as the rest of men," and which, lest they should seem as other men, leads them to embrace and to devise novelties even of the most absurd kind. It is pride which rouses in them the spirit of disobedience and causes them to demand a compromise between authority and liberty. It is owing to their pride that they seek to be reformers of others, while they forget to reform themselves, and that they are found to be utterly wanting in respect for authority, even for the supreme authority. Truly, there is no road which leads so directly and so quickly to modernism as pride. When a Catholic layman or a priest forgets the precept of the Christian life, which obliges us to renounce ourselves if we would follow Christ, and neglects to tear pride from his heart, then it is he who most of all is a fully ripe subject for the errors of modernism.